we're excited for spring, even though it's a little rainy here today. The weather's been nicer here. So I'm personally excited to go on more hikes. I'm excited to get into, there's a lot of good hikes around Philadelphia. So I'm really excited to explore some of that more as it gets warmer. And we'll popcorn to other people. So I'll popcorn to Jessica.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Hi, Dorothy. My name is Jessica. I help a little bit behind the scenes for Amnesty International, so I figured I might as well start coming to the meetings so I can be a face and not just a name behind things. What I'm looking forward to for spring, definitely hiking as well, and also kayaking. It'll be nice to get back on the water this year. So, and then I just picked someone else. Okay, Dorothy, you're up.
Yeah, so Jessica is doing pretty much all of the work for the POC, and so the letters, she is helping with that. So when I told her about it, she was eager to help, and I must say she does almost everything now. It is fantastic. The POC, the urgent actions, and so we somehow communicate, of course, and do some things together, but she's a tremendous help. So let us all thank her for all she's doing. It's a lot of work.
Thank you.
Great. Dorothy, do you want to pass it off to someone else?
Yeah, so Donna.
Oh, hello. Thank you, Dorothy. I am Donna Hilburn Campbell. I won't be excited until I see actual human beings again. That's what will be exciting. I am in Florida where I see too many human beings without masks, in bars, in a restaurant, and it is frightening, although people are getting vaccinated. But yeah, I'm in Florida, Melbourne Beach, right near Orlando. Yeah, I'm excited for one thing. I got to give a plug. My Embracing Race, based out of Collingswood, New Jersey, in June, the end of June, I think the 20th, is going to be having a Juneteenth celebration in Collingswood, New Jersey. Just want to pass that on.
Oh, that's great news.
Yep. Oh, I have to tag somebody. I will tag Tara? Am I saying that right?
You're fine. Okay. It depends on the language. So Tara is fine. Hi, everyone. My name is Tara. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I actually am joining your meeting start one time only, or maybe other times, but I am the staff member for the Gender, Sexuality, and Identity program. So I'm down here in DC, actually. I mean, for my home office, so I could be anywhere, but my home office being the home bedroom in a small chair I sit on. But I'm really thrilled to join you and today, and I'm really looking forward to cherry blossom season, which down here is obviously a big deal, and peak bloom is next Friday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So if you email me, I will not be replying because I will be walking around the town Thursday, Friday. I've taken off, obviously not by the tidal basin where tourists are going to be like, you know, Typhoid Mary, but around our neighborhood is going to be very beautiful. So very excited about that. I will pass to Sam.
Hey, all. I'm Sam. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a student at Penn and excited for it in the spring, walking outside. Yeah, I can't take hikes being grounded here, but you know, the longer the walk I can take, the better I feel. And I don't have to wear a coat anymore that's super heavy, so that's exciting. And then Mara.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Mara, she, her, and something I'm looking forward to this spring. I think you all nailed, like you hit it on the nail with the spring weather. Actually, now I want to see if there's some prime blooming. I'm out in California right now, to see if there's anything around here that I should be aware of with dates coming forward. Yeah, but happy to be here.
Great. And I think then last but not least, we have Susanna.
Well, I'm here in South Jersey, and I'm really enjoying riding my bicycle. And I've put a deposit on an electric bicycle, and I'm very interested at the moment in solar panels and batteries and trying to figure out ones that don't blow up. Yeah, so that's it. And behind me is that picture is a forest that's about 500 yards from my house. So it's very nice to
Oh my
walk.
gosh.
Yeah. Yeah, come visit. I'll take you there.
Thanks for sharing.
I would like to add to this. Susanna, I wrote to you about the electric bike,
Yes.
and actually we got trike now. I had a very bad accident, so I want to warn everybody. Electric bikes are feared for bad accidents, especially in elderly people. And so my accident was such that I never touched a normal bike again, an electric bike, and also no normal bike, because I also had on a normal one an accident, but much less. So today, we, for the first time, my husband and I, and this is spring, of course, it's fantastic, tried that trike. So we took our old trike, which was hard to get up the hills, normal trike. So that's 3 wheels and down on the floor on the road. And we had a motor added onto it. So now we are using that trike with a motor, and that's actually perfect. But when we wanted to go up the hill and we don't know that thing, the chain just dislocated and with a big blow. So now we got stuck on the hill, but we'll learn how to do that. So be careful with electric bikes, but a trike, there's also single trikes, not double trikes, where you can be down on the ground where it's not dangerous. So they are much easier to drive than the normal electric bikes and much less dangerous. Okay, so that was my spring event, and it's fantastic, all day outside.
Oh, sounds nice. Okay, well, we will go ahead and get started, and I will pass it over to Tara to get us started today. At last month's meeting, just a little bit of preface for folks who weren't here. At last month's meeting, I shared some information that I had learned at a monthly membership call regarding just some of the work that Amnesty was doing for International Women's Day at the beginning of March. And we were all really interested in it, and we were just having this huge discussion. And Tara was one of the speakers at that meeting, and I reached out to ask her to come join us and speak a little bit more about women's rights throughout the world, as well as the US, as well as right here in our own backyard. So we're excited to have Tara here today to talk to us a little bit more. And yeah, I'll pass it to you. You can go ahead, take it away.
Pardon me, yeah. Well, excuse me. I've had a tickle in my throat all day, which how I got sick never going outside, I don't know. Well, I'm really happy to be here. And actually what I can do is do a little bit of information from that webinar and share the slides, and you're all welcome to have that. And then basically leave a lot of time for question and discussion, because there is unfortunately no end to the number of topics we could discuss in terms of International Women's Day and women's rights. Let me give a little bit of context. So, as you all know, Amnesty's mission is all rights for all people. So easy peasy, we'll be done in a year. And so that, the sort of world's our oyster in terms of the portfolio that we we work on. For Amnesty USA, so we're, as you know, one country section in terms of the broader movement. We work both on both issues foreign and domestic. And if you've been around a while, you know that that's not always been the case, that actually in the amnesty movement, that there was a preclusion that you couldn't work on your own country for both safety and efficacy rules. And that changed like actually fairly recently. It was like the 90s, it was not that long ago. The only exception to that in the US had been the death penalty work. So there's this really interesting legacy of Amnesty members and movements who tended to be like foreign policy minded, right? Like probably all of you on this call are foreign policy nerds, which is like my exact love language is foreign policy. And so, but also then recognizing that as the US section, we have immense influence and power that other sections like Amnesty Iceland might not have, but that also like within our own borders are the similar issues that we're talking about in foreign policy. And I think this is a really interesting, both intellectual and actual challenge that we face as Amnesty International USA, that we have opportunity in our foreign policy as US foreign policy, and also as like Americans like trying to impact another foreign leader, like writing your letter to when I was in a local group in St. Louis, we used to write to Bashar al-Assad, who's the dictator of Syria, and I was just imagining him reading my letters being like, dear dictator Assad, please release this person. So whether we're making that individual connection to a foreign government or we're trying to leverage the US government to make that connection. So it's a bit of the background in terms of how I think about our portfolio work and how we make the decisions we make as to where we're spending our time, because we could spend it loads of places, obviously. Unfortunately, there are just a litany of women's rights abuses. So the other thing that's probably like super obvious to you all, but bears repeating, is that the concept of women's rights as human rights is not a universally agreed upon concept. And that's why we say it aloud that women's rights are human rights, because it's so obvious. But if it were obvious to everyone, we wouldn't have to say it. We wouldn't have to have an International Women's Day if there wasn't specific human rights violations that were disproportionately impacting women and girls, or that women and girls were targeted because of their sex, gender, or presumed sex and gender. So that's something too. And Amnesty has been really part of the international movement to mainstream women's rights work, both in multilateral fora like the UN, but also in terms of the country work we do, and that to really like mainstream that work through saying like it's so obvious and so normal, but it is actually a pretty radical thing to say and to do. So I want to lift that up as well. It's radical because of how abnormal it is in a patriarchal world that really demands that actually women's rights aren't human rights, that if anything, they're super specialized, right? If we agree that they're rights, which many governments don't, they're super specialized rights. They're not normal human rights, right? And that is an attitude that we're up against a lot, including in the US, that see the rights that impact women and girls disproportionately, or rights violations that are targeted against women and girls because of their sex or gender, presumed sex or gender, that they're like specialty or other rights. And like human rights are in the US civil political rights, right? And they're not these other things, right? So those are the sort of big contexts in which I take my cues as a staff person, and thinking about where I'm spending my time in portfolio and where I'm asking our activists to spend their time, and thinking about what's strategic. So my background, I actually, so I've been on staff about 7 years. I have no concept of time right now. 6 or 7 years I've been on staff, but I've been with Amnesty since 2002, which is a lifetime. So I've been around too long. And I joined as a member when I was in graduate school, actually at the Washington University in St. Louis. And I was getting my PhD in gender and in English, and was feeling disconnected from life. You know, when you're in a graduate program and you just all you're doing is that thing, and joined a local group that was active there. So I was part of the Amnesty 105, which is the St. Louis local group, still kicking and doing great work. So I got started in that, and then our Stop Violence Against Women campaign started. Amnesty started a specific campaign on violence against women and girls, which was really revolutionary. This is like in 2002, so it's like kind of shocking and sad, but it was really revolutionary in terms of the global rights movement. So And then before I joined staff as a professor of women and gender studies and worked in other UN jobs and whatever else, and then joined staff a number of years ago. So that's the context in which I bring all this information. So I'm going to talk about, I'm looking and wishing I could find this. I'm going to talk about, oh, I know where it is. Give me one hot second and I will bring this up. If I had thought about this, I would have brought it up ahead of time, but of course, had not quite gotten through my day. Still a million miles behind. Here we go. I'm going to just use a few slides so you're not just looking at my beautiful face talking the whole time. We won't go through all of them. It's really just a pointer. And I'm going to talk about both a sexual and reproductive health and rights issue, as well as women's human rights defenders. And that's two sub-issues within women's rights. But that's where we are focused right now in our portfolio. I am smart as Zoom. Share screen. Excellent. All right, so you are looking at, so a few things you'll see, I'm just gonna really quickly tick through because it's not, we're gonna share all of them. I really wanna get into discussion. So this is from the membership call. I won't go through all of this, but I do want to focus on the US's global abortion ban. So the question of sexual and reproductive health and rights, which, man, if you thought talking about women's rights could be controversial in the mainstream rights movement, get into sexual and reproductive health and rights, which not unsubstantially is something that disproportionately impacts women and girls, and therefore is much more likely to be dismissed, oh, hello, it automatically goes, by the global rights movement and by states that have a vested interest in not respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights. So sexual and reproductive human rights, health and rights, pardon me, are human rights, as are women's rights. And they affect everybody. Everybody has sexual and reproductive health and rights, or sexual and reproductive rights, and of course, health. I don't know how to stop that from going. And everybody has a stake in that, but disproportionately women and girls are impacted by a state not protecting, respecting, or fulfilling those rights. One of the things that we're focused on right now is the US's foreign policy that imposes a global abortion ban. So what does this mean? So the US imposes a global abortion ban through its funding. So as you all know, the US is a major funder, decreasingly these days, and we would argue they should do more, but like is a major funder for so-called developing countries and spaces which need funding to promote health, basic services, et cetera. Currently, the US restricts US funding in terms of, it's a law called the Helms Act, which is no US funding can go through to abortion services for any reason. That's a law in the United States. It needs to be overturned. But regardless of that law, there's also something called the Global Gag Rule. Again, sorry, I don't know how to turn the auto thing off. The Global Gag Rule. And what this does is when the Global Gag Rule is imposed, it says not only can no US funding go to abortion services, but your own funding, clinic in Tanzania, your own money cannot go to abortion services. And not just performing an abortion, but also telling someone where they can receive a safe abortion, that counts, or giving them information about family planning, which includes references to abortion, or lobbying for more liberal abortion laws in your own country that would help save lives. You can't do that, because if you do with your own money, you'll lose our money. So what this essentially does is it gags, it's called the Gag Rule because it gags organizations, again, my apologies, I'm not as smart as slides. It gags organizations from giving the care that they need to give to people that is part of both their human rights and necessary for health. And of course, highest standard of care of health is a human right in and of itself. So the Global Gag Rule, sometimes it's called the Mexico City policy because it was signed in Mexico. So it was announced in Mexico City by only US people. I'm sure Mexico City's like, please don't involve us. Has been reinstated by every Republican president and then rescinded by every Democratic president since Ronald Reagan. And it's extremely disruptive to global healthcare. So currently under President Biden, that policy is rescinded, but the last 4 years, we had the Global Gag Rule kind of on steroids. And it restricts all US funding. So why is this a problem? Well, it's deadly and it's ineffective. So Global Gag Rule, the quote unquote purpose of Global Gag Rule is to decrease abortion, to limit abortion, because the argument of those champions for the Global Gag Rule is abortion is bad, we don't want abortions, the US shouldn't pay for abortions. Well, again, many problems with that. Whether or not global abortion is bad is an individual moral choice, and everyone has the right to their own opinion. But access to abortion is a human rights issue, and restricting abortion does not reduce abortion. It just makes it more deadly.
Mhm.
So the first problem is it doesn't work. If that's what you want to do, which we're not agreeing with either way, we don't have a stake in whether or not someone has an abortion, just they have access to if they want one. It doesn't work. It actually increases rates of abortion because it disrupts the money that clinics and hospitals and governments use for comprehensive reproductive health care. But it doesn't increase the rate of safe abortion. It increases the rates of unsafe abortion. So the first thing is there's no such thing as an abortion ban. There's only a safe abortion ban. And that's played out through tons and tons of data. There's only safe abortion bans. When you ban abortion, rates of abortion actually increase and they just get more deadly. I'm so sorry, I have no idea how to work slides clearly. There are more unintended pregnancies in the global gag rule, under global gag rule. There's a higher rate of maternal death and preventable maternal mortality. There's an increase in unsafe abortion. Women and girls lose access to contraception, and it interrupts efficacy and speed of humanitarian aid. So there's just a load of reasons that it's a bad idea. Of course, it's not felt equally globally, including in places where the US is giving aid. So if we use, for example, Lesotho, which has a vibrant program where USAID funds condom distribution and HIV prevention, everyone will be impacted, but not everyone will be impacted equally. So women, particularly poor women, are most impacted by gag globally. Pregnant people, which includes cis women, it also can include trans men and queer people, lose access to health services and abortion services. Marginalized groups and spaces like LGBTI community or sex workers also lose critical healthcare services like HIV prevention. Because what a organization has to determine is whether or not they lose all their US funding, which could be the backbone of how they keep their basic services going, or whether or not they take that funding and then cut people off from critical health care. So it's really this impossible choice that organizations face, and either way, people are losing services. What are the human rights at stake? I'm glad you asked. So you have the right to life, you have the right to health, you have the right to equality and information and privacy and expression, and all these things are compromised with the global gag rule. When you limit abortion, when you restrict abortion, when you ban abortion, these are the things that are at stake. So we've been pushing for the Global HER Act, which would permanently repeal the global gag rule. So it allows foreign organizations who receive US aid to provide any of their services, including safe abortion. Again, that US money does not go to abortion, which we would argue is a problem, but that is the law. So this doesn't mean US money all of a sudden goes to abortion, which is one of the arguments against it. Oh, we'll be funding abortions, which we would say like, abortions are healthcare, why is that a problem? But it's not true, it doesn't fund abortions. It means someone else can use their own money to do that work. It allows NGOs to use to address the specific needs of their population. So this could be a health NGO or a clinic or a hospital or a foreign government. And it, of course, like promotes good actual medical practice as opposed to ideological imposition. So whether or not someone gets an abortion is entirely up to that person. And like, it is okay to, like Amnesty International believes that you have the right to believe what you want. It is not okay to tell someone else they can't access their rights. So this just sort of rehashes that. So, and I can, I'll include these links in the chat, but that's a sort of example presentation style as to the type of work we're doing in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights globally. And I will actually pause this. Let's see if I can. We've been on Zoom for like a year and I'm still trying to figure out how to do the internet. It was new when I was in college. So that's an example of the type of way that women's rights work manifests itself in our portfolio, right? The right to abortion is a critical right for women globally. It's a right for anyone who can get pregnant, which includes cis women, it includes trans men, it includes queer folks, but it disproportionately impacts cis women, right? And we see that as a central way of thinking about how women are able to access the full spectrum of their rights. If you don't have the right to if you don't have access to your sexual and reproductive rights, those specific rights are being violated, right? The highest standard of care, your right to life could be impacted, your right to be freedom from torture if you're forced to carry a pregnancy under certain circumstances. Like there's a number of rights directly impacted, but also your ability to access other, quote unquote, other rights, right? Your right to participate in society, in your government, which often in the US we think is like the right to vote. That can look like a lot of things, but like if you cannot control your own body and what your destiny is with your body, like the access to vote may or may not mean anything to you if you can't physically get there, if you can't make decisions that are about yourself, right? Your access to work, your right to work is impacted if you can't control the number of children and the spacing of children that you have. Certainly your access to participate in your own culture could be impacted. So your economic, cultural, social rights could be impacted. So it's one of the things we think about is one, how is this a right under international human rights law, treaty, and agreements in and of itself, right? Like I detailed the right to life, the right to education, the right to the highest standard of medical care, et cetera. But then also, like, people are human beings, like we're not a body of rights. We're human beings who are trying to live like just a normal life, whatever that might look like for us. So how are all those other things we're trying to do also impacted by this right? And that's where I think sexual and reproductive health and rights are actually really illustrative and maybe some of the best examples of that. Although like your right to water is a very good example of like, if you don't have your right to water, the right to participate in government, not going to mean a whole lot to you, right? So all the rights are interconnected, and you need all of them. And in the US and in Western countries, there tends to be an emphasis on civil and political rights in rights discourse. And in other countries, particularly like Cold War country, the split comes from the Cold War, there tends to be an emphasis on economic, cultural, and social rights. So some countries tend to uplift certain bodies of rights and like really downplay certain bodies of rights. And you all know this, sitting here in the United States, the US very much does not like to talk about economic, cultural, social rights. Those somehow sound communist. They sound like not exciting, and we're also not good at them. And like, because we refuse to respect, protect, and fulfill them. And we could be good at them, not rocket science. Like we could be good at them, but there's political motivation not to be. So the US tends to sort of dial up its rhetoric and its laws and protections around civil and political rights. And it tends to downplay other rights, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. Sexual and reproductive rights have been so politicized in the United States, which by the way is not always the case. Like this is particularly the right to abortion was very specifically politicized in the 80s and 90s, particularly starting in the late 70s, but really in the 80s and 90s, politicized for like a very specific political reason. And it's not to say that people right now don't have deep held personal beliefs about abortion. That may be true, but that there's a history to how people got there, which is like deeply politicized. So it means like when we're talking about a rights framework as Amnesty folks, like we're like, yes, but human rights. You could be talking to someone who's like, but it's wrong. And you're like, how do I answer that? Because it could be a moral or a religious question for someone, right? And our job is not to tell someone that religion is good or bad or wrong, or that their belief I agree with. Like, I am also a religious person. I believe abortion can be a blessing, but that's not the debate I have with people, right? Because our focus is human rights. But there are real implications because of the way we think in our context and as both as women's rights defenders, as sexual and reproductive rights defenders, and as like people in the United States. So this one example of the types of things and work that we're doing to promote women's rights. There's a lot more. We work also particularly on gender-based violence, partly because when Amnesty began doing campaigning around women's rights, we started with the question of violence against women and girls as one of the sort of, there's a lot of reasons why, but it seemed really clear that instead of, for example, political participation or like women in democracy or like women in the world of work. I mean, there's loads of human rights sub-issues, right? But that like the question of violence against women and girls was not taken particularly seriously as a human rights issue. Not a load of people at the UN would be like, this is a good thing, but it wasn't sort of mainstreamed as an idea that this is a human rights issue. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, Amnesty really worked to mainstream this question of gender-based violence as a human rights issue. So again, if you are not physically safe, if you cannot experience life with your right to live free from violence, do any of these other rights, are they open to you, right? And so we launched this campaign in 2002, which is how I actually got involved with Amnesty, that really built our credibility, experience, and expertise around that issue. So it's partly why we still work on that issue quite a bit, is because we have been working on that issue for so long. And so we've built up a lot of expertise and a lot of legacy work on that, as opposed to the question of women's participation in society, right? Which is also a human rights issue, but but other organizations are doing that work as well. So I also spend a lot of my time working, particularly because of the place of the United States government, working on the US foreign policy in regards to gender-based violence, which is like, could suck more, frankly, but isn't really great in terms of like what we do or what we don't do. So a lot of my job is trying to convince the United States that wherever it is, whether it should be there or not, is a question not for Amnesty International, but like wherever the United States is engaged in foreign affairs, that ending gender-based violence has to be part of that work. And there's loads of reasons for this. One is the right to live free from violence is in and of itself a human right, but also in terms of, pardon me, the United States foreign policy, it is not effective if you don't address gender and gender-based violence. So if you think about COVID response, which is all we're thinking about, that the United States response to COVID, obviously domestically, has been, let's say, hit or miss under the last administration, and is still continuing to sort of hit or miss as we go. But we didn't really have a response to like how our foreign aid or foreign affairs was working. When we finally started to build that, like what data shows, even in the last year and a half of COVID, the last year and whatever months of COVID, is that gender-based violence both is a cause and a symptom of COVID exacerbation. So if you are not addressing gender-based violence and you go into like help address COVID, it's going to be less effective. You're not going to be able to end COVID as quickly. And of course, gender-based violence rates increased under COVID because of people being stuck in lockdown with their abusers, people not having as many economic opportunities that could help them get out of situations, people not being able to move about freely, et cetera, because of health lockdowns. So that's another example of how all these issues are so sort of deliciously complicated in terms of like, again, that foreign policy nerdy part, but also in terms of how we see at Amnesty women's rights as not just its own separate body of work that we should always be doing, but also as integrated into all our work. Like if we don't address the question of women's rights in all our work, we won't be doing that work effectively. So if we're working on COVID, which we are, in terms of equal distribution, and we don't address the question of gender and particularly gender-based violence, like it's not going to be as effective for our human rights. So if you get emails from me periodically, which hopefully you do, they're going to be on the Global Her Act, and they're going to be on Safe from the Start, which is our bill working to end gender-based violence in emergencies, which again, it could be any number of things because I spend a lot of my time working across the particularly State Department and USAID, but that's the place where we see a sort of opportunity to really push a bill past that finish line, which is getting increasingly difficult, to be honest. So when we have those opportunities, we really try and seize on them. The last thing that I would highlight in our work on women's rights, it's not the end of that work, but the sort of focus of my 2021 portfolio is in terms of Indigenous women here in the United States. And I have loads of presentations on this that I'll just share the slides some other time because clearly I don't know how to use them online without making them tick through, but and I can share those to you, Amara, and you can share them out. But we have been working on the question, so Indigenous rights, also human rights, and Indigenous peoples globally are impacted in just a bananagrams number of ways from policy, both domestic and foreign. And there's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is a non-binding treaty to which the US is a party, which outlines the way in which Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by like kind of everything. And particularly you think in the US is a great example. And that kind of plays out across loads and loads of states. It looks slightly different in Kenya than it does here, but it looks a lot the same in Canada as it does here, and even in places like Peru and Brazil and whatever else. So our work on this has been really interesting for lots of reasons. One, we're a non-indigenous organization, right? We are an Anglo-dominant organization in a colonial space in which like the United States is a colonial power, not just in terms of what we do with other countries now, but in terms of how the US became a sovereign recognized government is through the taking of indigenous territory. So it's a really complicated space to work in as a non-indigenous led organization. And I am not an indigenous person working on these issues, and I head our portfolio on these issues. In 2007, we launched a report called the Maze of Injustice Report, which I'll actually put down here in the chat because, you know, Amnesty has done a load of really good work, just like, you know, lots of really great things, obviously. And I've been with Amnesty way too long. I truly like this report is probably one of the most powerful and impactful things that we've done as Amnesty USA. It's So I share that with you. It is very old at this point. It's 14 years old, but it is a report that details, the very short version is it's a report that details the incredibly high rates of sexual violence against Native American and Alaskan Native women. So Native American, Alaskan Native women experience violence at more than 2 times the rate of any other ethnicity in the United States. So 1 in 2 Native women will be raped in her lifetime. And our stats on the page say 1 in 3, and those unfortunately are out of date. It's about 1 in 2. And what our research showed is what Indigenous women have been saying for a long time. So this was not any new information. It was just us raising that, shining that light, right? That sort of Amnesty candle metaphor, shining the light on what Indigenous activists have been saying for a long time. Is we were in communities where not one person we talked to had not experienced sexual assault or rape. I mean, the rates are staggering. And there's a lot of reasons that this is happening. The short version is colonialism. The long version is like colonialism, and all the things that sort of go with that. The human rights imperative here is that the United States federal government, which is a recognized state, which has signed all these treaties on violence and on the right to live free from violence, whatever else, is failing in its obligation. Like clearly, any violence against anyone is it's failure of the state that they need to address. But if the rates of one group are astronomically higher than any other group, there's like something very specific going on there. So what's going on here is that unlike other demographics, most sexual violence committed against Native American, Alaskan Native women are committed by non-indigenous people. So people that they don't know. In the United States, most sexual violence is committed by a known associate. And that's not the same in Native American, Alaskan Native women. And the reason that's not the same is because the laws don't apply the same to Native survivors as they do to non-Native survivors. So the best example of this, and I'll just personalize it to make it a little easier to understand. If I were a Native woman and I lived in, let's say, the Rosebud, or let's use Standing Rock. You probably have heard of Standing Rock Reservation because of all the great water protector work they've done, which is in South Dakota, just across the border from North Dakota. And I live on the Standing Rock Reservation border, or if I live in the reservation. If I am raped by a non-Native man, the local police cannot hold him for questioning. They cannot arrest him. They cannot follow him to his house. They cannot, and not all rape is perpetrated by men, but the majority of rape is perpetrated by men. Like they cannot bring him to trial. They can, like, it applies differently because it's a question of jurisdiction. It's still illegal for that person to have committed sexual violence against a Native woman, but it's illegal in a federal system. So the FBI has to prosecute that crime. And the reality is the FBI is not prosecuting those crimes because the FBI is doing drug crimes and other big, more flashy crimes, and they're not flying out to the middle of South Dakota to prosecute a rape crime. So of course it's still illegal. It's not like it's like legal, although it wasn't always illegal, I should say, but like it is now illegal to commit rape against Native women. But like how the reality of that justice gets played out depends on who the perpetrator is. And 86% of perpetration is committed by non-Native men. And that matters because the laws apply differently. They apply differently depending on the race or ethnicity of, and it's race considered by US Census data, the race and ethnicity of the victim and of the perpetrator. It depends on, and this is only for Indigenous or non-Indigenous. Not like if the perpetrator was Black or white, that part doesn't matter. But if the perpetrator is Indigenous or not Indigenous, and where that crime took place. So did that crime take place on tribal land, or did it take place on federal land or state land? And did that crime, and now where that perpetrator resides. So if, and that gets much more complicated than it needs to. Like if the perpetrator committed the crime on tribal land and now they're hanging out on tribal land, they can't be arrested. If they committed it on federal land and they're in tribal land, they can't get arrested. I mean, it's just like, it's bonkers. It feels like it's made up. It feels like I'm telling you lies. It is not made up. It is a crazy maze of jurisdiction, which is what we called our report, the maze of injustice. That means that you have perpetrators committing violence against Native women and there are no consequences. There are just no consequences, because it's the duty of the federal government, because of all these extremely racist laws that the US has passed, making local courts not be able to prosecute non-native perpetrators. But then it's dependent basically on like the US Circuit Court to take up this case. Well, they're not taking up this case because it's like small potatoes, right? An individual rape case compared to like a multi-billion-dollar drug bust is not what the FBI is pursuing. So it's bananas. And the more you dig into it, the more bananas it gets. It's just honestly, woof, been an education. So Amnesty's engagement in this has been, again, we are not the first people to talk about this. Like Indigenous women activists particularly have been like raising this alarm for a long time and have not been listened to. And in 2007, Amnesty launched our report, which really helped platform this reality. And many things have happened since then. The Tribal Law and Order Act has passed, which started to like chip away at some of the issues around jurisdiction. The Violence Against Women Act was passed in 2013. Well, 2015, it was reauthorized, which included tribal provisions, because another thing, sorry, I'm starting to sound like one of those people who's like, it's all crazy. It is all crazy. It's so bananas. The Violence Against Women Act, whenever you hear a law that says like women are going to get XYZ or kids are going to get this type of, you know, support, always put an asterisk against that says, except for Indigenous folks. Because if they live in reservation, they won't get it. So for example, the Violence Against Women Act, as you may know, is the main funding mechanism by the US government that funds like the hotline, the domestic violence hotline and the sexual assault hotline. It funds most domestic violence shelters in the US. A massive proportion of their budgets come from the Violence Against Women Act. It funds all the training programs for police, like how do you respond to domestic violence? My husband used to work for one where it's like training police to identify domestic violence cases. If they went in on like some sort of call and they go in, how do they make sure domestic violence is not happening, and they can talk to the victim separately to make sure she's safe or he's safe, you know, et cetera. So all that stuff is funded by the Violence Against Women Act. Before 2015, none of that money could go to tribes. No money could go to their local government. And you're talking about, it'd be like saying I'm from California, as I was telling Mara in the chat, sharing some flower news and California blooms. I'm from the Central Valley, which is like the least exciting part of California, as Mara will know. I'm from outside of Fresno. But so if I lived in Fresno and the Violence Against Women Act passed and they're like, good news, we've got X bazillion dollars for domestic violence shelters, not Fresno. Everybody's going to get trained on how your courts can best identify domestic violence cases, not Fresno. All your police are going to get trained in not Fresno. I mean, that is what's happening, because it's like not that government, not that local government, because it's tribal government. And there is no justification for this. It is 100% super racist attitudes towards local governments that are tribal, as opposed to local governments that are not tribal. Again, like the difference between the Fresno local government and the Standing Rock Sioux local government is one is tribal, the other is not tribal. So the Violence Against Women Act is one place where we saw changes in 2015 for the first time. They allowed tribes to receive that money. I will say this, they allowed Native American, not Alaska Native tribes, because there's the racism just goes deep and deep and deep. And it gets complicated. But now that is up for reauthorization. So we have to reauthorize VAWA. A spending bill has to be reauthorized usually every 5 years, which is why bills have to get voted on all the time. Pardon me. And Republicans want to strip out those provisions because they don't like giving away sovereignty. And there's a major question here as to whether or not tribes should have any sovereignty over their own money and over their own programs that should be federally funded. So that's another example of the work we do, which is why you might see us talking about the Violence Against Women Act in terms of of the billion things Amnesty could spend its time talking about, and there are zillions. Why do we talk about those things, right? Partly because I talked about that gender-based violence aspect. It's really where we've built our expertise, and we have a value add that other organizations really need us to come into, and because of this tribal aspect as well. Again, tribal organizations have been doing this work for a long time. And what Amnesty's been able to do is to say hey, people in power, you seem not to be listening to the people who know. Let us show you that this is what's going on. Let us give you package that information. So those are the sort of three big areas that I've been spending my women's rights time the last number of years. Is one on violence against Indigenous women and girls here in the US, particularly Native American, Alaskan Native, because Native Hawaiians are considered totally separate by the US government, another really interesting problem. 2, on gender-based violence globally, and 3, on sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I'll mainly stop there. I'll say that one of the interesting things is like sexual and reproductive health and rights here in the United States also very much under attack. And so I encourage you in whatever ways you can to support, mainstreaming sexual and reproductive health and rights, talking about it, taking action when you can, contacting your legislators when they're considering both super local things like within your college. Are there condoms? Is there birth control? Is there Plan B? In your county, in your state, in the country. So it's frankly just capacity and efficacy that we can't effectively be a million places at once, that we don't also are like, here's why you should fight this abortion ban, like, because of course you should, right? Because of course it's a human rights violation. It's really a question of like, we don't have the million resources. And it's, even we did, we're campaigning organizations, so you sort of focus in places you think you can make a sort of big push on. So it's a lot of women's rights. I was like, I'm super only going to talk for 20 minutes and then got on a roll about tribal law. So happy to take questions for 10 minutes if you have time.
Yeah.
And I'll put some actions in the chat. So
where's the view? Okay.
I really appreciated learning about the tribal laws. So thank you for bringing that piece into the conversation. I don't know if you've ever read or heard of Miriam Kaba and her work around
I don't think so.
Abolitionist organizing, but also like around racialized gender violence. And I bring her into the conversation to ask, like you mentioned a lot about policing and increasing forms of punishment in reaction to the sexual violence, but wondering if the work that you do also involves other forms of accountability that are more community-based or Indigenous led.
Yeah, so one, I'd love for you to either Slack me in the chat right now or email me that resource. I don't know that off the top of my head, but that's a really complicated, interesting, and very good question around the Violence Against Women Act itself is sort of focused on a justice policing model, which is funding. It's also like funding survivor groups, et cetera, but it's mainly like, do you train police? Can you get through the court system, et cetera? So, and last year our focus in this work, Violence Against Indigenous Women, was focused on the question of a rape kit, which is part of post-rape care. If you're assaulted, you go into the hospital or a clinic, they do a number of things, one of which is they do a test to collect evidence so that if you decide to pursue a case that you have evidence, because you can't, and this is where like TV is actually accurate, if you don't have that evidence, they're not going to pursue a case. But that is like a criminal justice reaction, right, to crime and or to assault or to rights violation. So I think that that's a place, frankly, where we're not super great at, because we are we're like a law and treaty organization. We're like, why do you do these things? Because you agreed to these human rights laws, as opposed to because inherently you should not rape women, right? Like that's not our argument. Our argument is, I mean, it is our argument, but it's also like because there's human rights that are detailed out in these ways and you've agreed to those things, which is like a law and binding treaty question. It's not, we don't like lead with that because it's like everyone sort of just agrees you shouldn't rape women, so we sort of lead with that. But everyone sort of mainly agrees that, but it does present some challenges in places I think we've shown better on work in that is in terms of our gun violence work, where we're looking at community-led solutions instead of like, hey, anybody who has an illegal gun should go to prison for 400 years, which would deeply disproportionately impact communities of color that'll be targeted by laws disproportionately, would be, and not, it's not communities of color that disproportionately funds, but they'd be disproportionately targeted. It's what are community violence interruption programs looking like? What are community-led solutions? And so some of our gun violence work has started to do that better than other of our work. Our last, honestly, the Violence Against Women movement, or it's always the anti-violence against women movement in the US, has traditionally been pretty, what's the shorthand, like law and order focused, right? Or police do the crime, do the time focused. And like what particularly women and communities of color are saying is like, that's not working. And it's not working for a number of reasons. And it's not working because one, it adds to the over-policing and over-incarceration of men of color, right, but also like, a survivor who is from a community that's disproportionately impacted by police violence, number one, may not trust the police to handle this case, and for good reason, and for very good reason, because police addressing a violence against women cases very much depends on the race of the survivor and the victim. A victim survivor is something we tend to use interchangeably, but but also like they may not want what women have told us and what women have told lots of people, and non-cis women and men can also be like victims, survivors of violence, but disproportionately it's women, is that they just want the abuse to stop. It's not that they necessarily want their partner to go to jail for the rest of his life, right? That might not actually, now for some people that may be, and we tend to try to be survivor centered, but that like mostly they want that to stop. And the state has failed that person perpetrating the violence as well, right? The state's obligation is not just in terms of human rights, it's not just to respect the right, so protect, respect, defend. Protect the right is to say like fulfill. The respect the right is to have to say like the United States government does not perpetrate violence against women. So the US government itself does not commit violence, whether it's police or state funded teachers or whatever. The state itself does not perpetrate violence. Protect that right means having laws that say it's illegal for a private citizen to perpetrate violence against women, right? But fulfill that right means creating an environment in which violence is not perpetrated, which means creating an environment in which a perpetrator does not become a perpetrator. Right. And that I think is where we always call for those things as Amnesty, but it's harder to create that. It's harder to show that as a solution because it's so long term and it's so involved, right? It means for violence against women and girls, ultimately a perpetrator is accountable for their own actions, it means having job programs so that someone has not reached a level where they're acting out in a way that's counterproductive. It means creating an environment in which that child is not abused, because most people who commit abuse against women were abused as children. It means creating a space in which that person has access to education and resources that, yada, 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 so that you don't have a perpetrator you're just punishing, but you actually don't have a perpetrator. Like that is actually what fulfillment of that human rights is. And I think that's been a struggle, and it's been particularly a struggle in the violence against women movement, because in the US that has been dominated by middle to upper class white women. And that's changing in terms of who has access to the power within the movement. Is still pretty subdued in terms of power makers in the US, but who has power in the movement or voice in the movement has tended to be upper middle class white women. And that is changing, where more diverse voices are coming in and being like, over policing not always the answer, because that hasn't served our communities super well. So we're seeing that change to offer more community-based solutions or holistic justice solutions. The movement itself is catching up, and we certainly are catching up in that. It means, it's something I think about a lot. We are producing an update to the report. I'm working on that now. So interesting and exciting and complicated and terrible. But from a research perspective, from a nerd perspective, it's like, yes, dive in. And one of the questions is, how do we call for both? Which is to say, like, if this is what the survivor wants, they should have access to this, because justice and remedy is a human right, but also that we look at more holistic community methods, so that if a survivor is saying like, no, like, let's look at a holistic healing here, particularly and not exclusively for Indigenous peoples, that should be the answer, right? As opposed to like, no, lock them up forever, because that's not going to solve the problem. That redresses the immediate crime, but it doesn't solve the problem. That was a really long answer, but a very good question. And I don't think we have it right all the time. I mean, I think it's a really challenging thing, but I'll definitely be looking at that article. We're particularly in our work with Indigenous women. There's 537 federally recognized tribes, so we don't pretend at all to speak for, like, there's no monolith of Indigenous women, like that's a very diverse crowd. But we are very, very aware that we need to be led by the voices of the community, which frankly, we should probably, in all our work, we should always be like that hyper aware, but particularly in our Indigenous work, we're very hyper aware. And the community is split. Like, for the most part, folks really want more policing resources because they are so underfunded. You don't get a lot of Indigenous women activists saying like, no, fear of police. That being said, proportionally, the highest number of people killed by police are Native American, Alaskan Native men. And so it's complicated, right? It's really complicated. But I'm excited to dive into the article that you provided.
Susanna, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. My concern is in language. I have a very sheltered life. But in the last election cycle, I came across 3 people who said to me, well, you know, you've got to vote for Trump because, you know, you can't be killing babies. Now, I was involved in the anti-abortion, pro, whatever, human rights choice, the choice efforts in Australia in the 1970s, Women's Liberation House. And once every 2 weeks, we'd tell people where they can go and get abortions, which is really what it was. And once I had this incredible conversation with a man, his name was Dr. Jeffrey Davis, and he was a gynecologist, and he'd gone to Bangladesh, and he'd helped the government there, because, as you well know, rape is a weapon of war. And the Pakistani soldiers were told that they were to rape any woman they could in Bangladesh. Now, I don't understand the whole tribal thing, but the result was that there were a whole lot of Bangladeshi women who were having babies or were pregnant, and they were totally rejected by their families. And so he went along there and he did a whole lot of good, and they gave him some Rolls Royces as a gift because he was so helpful. But the issue is always that there seems to be some belief that the woman's right to choose somehow means that we are telling people to abort. And that's never been the case. And it seemed, what was interesting was the Irish case when they changed the law in Ireland. What happened was there was a dentist, and she got pregnant, and her life was in danger, and they wouldn't do anything to save her life, and she died. Mm-hmm. It was an awful thing, and this just galvanized people. They said, well, wait a minute, you know, what babies are you killing? I mean, this very brilliant professional woman, young woman, she died from this. Mm-hmm. And Ireland changed the law and actually made abortion legal. But my issue is I just want to know what the language is. I mean, what I'm seeing is, how do you, I don't know how to respond when someone says, oh, they're killing babies. And in fact, you know, I'm a Quaker, and I every now and then I bring something up in meeting, and it's like, oh gosh. So anyway, I brought this up a few weeks ago in a meeting, and these men said, well, you know, you're killing. Like there's something wrong with that. Of course you're killing. You know, you're ending something or other. I mean, an early term abortion, but you have no guarantee that fetus was going to be a child anyway. I mean, there's all kinds of things. So, but my concern is the language. I want to know the language that can convince people that it's actually in their benefits to, well, this is the job I want for you, Tara.
I mean, this is the $1 million question. And if I answer it, someone owes me $1 million. So, I mean, I'd say a number of things. One, God bless our Quaker friends, doing amazing activists throughout the ages, or activism. So there's a couple of things. There is no one magic answer. And that's the real trick and the problem. I'll say that there's the not answer, which I will give you, which is that human rights recognize the fetus as a rights holder. Like the agreed upon declarations and definitions, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, does not recognize the fetus as a right holder. This argument is not compelling to anyone. That one. What people are saying is like, why do you want to kill babies, right? That's and because, and I'll just use my own aunt.
That's exactly the issue. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have some snarky answers when people ask me that, but that's not helpful either. So I have an aunt who really used to be kind of liberal, but is now increasingly convinced that like the fetus is a baby and abortion is killing babies. And like, I just don't agree with that as a human being. Like as a religious human being, I don't agree that the fetus is a baby. I don't believe it's morally wrong to kill a baby, but that's something that like good people in good conscience could disagree with. I think that there's a couple things. One, there's a lot of people who are not acting in good faith and that perpetrate these narratives, but then someone who may or may not be acting in good faith picks up. And it's really frustrating to watch how like people who don't give a shit about babies or abortion use this as a political issue.
Right.
That being said, you may have an auntie or a friend or, you know, who is like, no, this is killing babies and therefore it's always wrong. And there's no magic answer. I think as a human rights person, what I'd say is like, it is up to every individual to decide for them when they believe life begins. Like Amnesty holds that that is true. You get to decide. I don't get to tell you, like I'll use my auntie, my Aunt Clara, like Auntie Clara, I don't get to tell you you're wrong, even though I believe you're wrong. Like I believe life does not begin at conception. I don't believe it, you know, like those things, but those are really personal beliefs. And there's no science that says this is when spiritual cognition happens, or is there a spirit? Like, you know, those are things that are individually held beliefs. And what instead we focus on, but again, it's like, I don't know, how do you convince someone who's like, you're killing babies? You're like, I don't know what to tell you, which is like, it's up to each individual to decide that.
Right. But the issue is worse than that. The issue is that this was actually the one reason they voted for this right wing.
Yeah.
This was
well, and that's the politicization. It's more important than anything else. It's more important than the actual children dying in cages. It's more important than the state killing people with the death penalty. That's a political issue.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, the way that I've talked about that is to say that, like, you know, there's lots of ways, but it just really depends on the individual. One is like, I'm not here to convince you you're wrong, because you're going to, frankly, the question of where life begins is not a rational question. It's a heart question. It's an irrational question.
Okay.
And like, I can't convince someone their religion or Fox News is wrong, but I can say that, like, that's not what I believe. Like, I don't believe life starts at conception. I don't believe abortion is wrong, but I support your right to have that belief, but you don't get to impose your belief on other people. Right. That's convincing sometimes it's not. The other example where you're talking about the woman who died in Ireland, which is to like show people the real life consequences of what happens when the right to abortion is not respected. And sometimes, because as opposed to the types of really racist narratives that happen here in the US around who gets abortion and who doesn't, which are deeply skewed, is like, here's what happens when you don't allow abortion to happen. Like, pregnant people die. And like, that's clearly not what you want. Now, some people I will say are like, fuck pregnant ladies because it's the fetus that matters. And I don't know that you have that conversation with them. I don't know how to talk to those people. But to talk about the real life consequences, I think is one thing. There's a broad movement in the United States and globally to normalize abortion, because that's also part of it, which is like, as opposed to abortion being some aberrant and crazy chance result, like that it's, or worst case scenario, that it's like a normal part of healthcare. And that's also, now that's not going to be convincing to everybody, but if more and more people are talking about it normally, as opposed to like, oh shit, I have an abortion, but like that will help as well. But these are all like, there's no magic bullet there, because it is a very, it's been so deeply weaponized, and it's coupled with then people feeling like they feel that they have really, really deep beliefs around this, but they're being told that this is the only thing that matters. And I don't want to say that like everyone who believes that is stupid, but because they're not, but that is part of that problem, is it becomes like the one thing. You vote for Trump, doesn't matter anything else because of abortion. And that, I mean, one thing that helped is like, that's a political tool and you're being used politically, and it's okay to believe those things, but like, yeah, just know that that's how you're being used. But it can be really tough to argue against that. And it's because there's no fact that you're like, I can factually tell you, because when life begins is not a fact, it's a belief. And it's tricky, but those are the things that people come back at, as opposed to like me being like, wow, in the Declaration, like no one's asking that question. They're saying, why do you want to kill babies? And what I've said is like, I don't believe that an abortion is killing babies.
Yes.
And like every person has to be able to make that choice for themselves.
Yes, that's
I don't know if it helps.
All by itself. Yes. I'm also a very religious.
Because you're not going to convince someone who believes it is killing babies that it's not.
Yeah, I am also a very religious person.
Yeah.
And my mother was a doctor in she died like 30 years ago. But I can remember when she was practicing. What happened was girls would have their appendix removed, and then they removed the baby at the same time. That was how you legally got over it. Now, she wouldn't do that, but she wouldn't stop me.
Interesting.
I mean, she was And in fact, she walked out of the Anglican church once when the priest got up and said, well, you've got to vote for this person because, they're opposed to abortion.
Oh yeah, she was like not having it.
Walked out. Although personally she was.
Good for her.
Yeah, good for her. Ballsy lady.
She didn't like abortion at all. She wasn't going to do it, but she wasn't going to stop anyone else doing it. And I like that attitude.
Yeah.
That's a good attitude. And that, of course, is really what it's all about. It's a woman's right to her own body.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's
the other thing we tried, and you'll see that I highlighted this, is that or to get pregnant. Yeah, to choose to get pregnant.
Not get pregnant, have a child, not have a child. It should be entirely the woman's right. And that's the way I see it. Yeah. Oh.
I don't know, and I'm so sorry I have to duck out here soon, but the other thing that and you'll see this in our notes, is that when we're talking with Republican legislators, I'm not trying to convince them abortion is a good and moral thing, even though as a person I truly believe it is a gift from God. Like, that's not what I'm trying to convince them. Instead, I say, like, if you're trying to end abortions, abortion bans don't work without condoms. Like, if you're trying to end abortion, which I'm not saying is a good thing, like, this isn't working. So sometimes that's helpful, but I would say that, like, sort of fact-based stuff isn't always super compelling to folks who are like, vote for Trump because you're like, that doesn't make any sense, actually. Like, abortions rose under Trump. Guess what? Like, like that's not helpful. But I have found that helpful for some legislators who are they just truly believe that abortion is wrong. And like, I disagree, but like, they get to believe that. And so if that's what you believe, then do something that helps end abortion, and abortion bans don't do that, right? Like, so that might be helpful too, but really it's like, believe me, if we knew the answer, I would be peddling that on every corner. But it's so individualized. But I appreciate the courage and the standing of your mother, who's just like, I'm not going to listen to this sort of baloney. So I just happy to connect with folks offline. I'll put my email in the chat, but also I know, Amara, that you have it as well.
I do,
Sorry, I have to run out. I am
Thank you so much.
missing the one immobile appointment on my Thursday, which is tacos.
This conversation has not ended, Sarah, but thank you so much. I think you've given us a great start. And heavens, learning about
and I'm happy to connect, Jessica, and but also Kitty. Oh my gosh, well, always welcome to Amnesty meetings. Hello, Kitty. It was so nice to meet you all, and as per always, I was like, I'm going to listen more and talk less. That didn't go well, but happy to talk anytime and listen more. Please feel free to email me, and happy to rejoin, and really appreciate y'all's time and dedication. And so you could do anything on a Thursday night. So human rights, well, I think it's super fun. Like, you could also be like knitting or watching TV. So I really appreciate. I know I'm a local group member previously myself, and I miss that community. So I really appreciate you all being here. And just appreciate you all working on women's rights. Happy to provide anything else. Amara, feel free to email me. Anyone else can email me. We'll Slack, that all good stuff.
Thank you all have a great night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yes.
Perfect.
Well done.
Well, I hope you all learned something new. I definitely did.
Wow.
I knew something. I wanted to raise this to her, but obviously we didn't have time. Something that I find to be so interesting is I'm really interested in true crime. I listen to like a lot of true crime podcasts and things like that. And and there's a lot of like serial killers who specifically target Indigenous women.
Yeah.
And I've been, I've known that for quite a while, but I never thought about,
I never realized,
how there could be like legal implications and why they're choosing Indigenous women. And that makes so much sense. Like, I wonder if like people go into Indigenous communities like to commit these like violent crimes against women. It seems like that's exactly what's happening because they know they won't get prosecuted.
Right.
Crazy.
It's just
I'm shocked about it.
God,
it's absolutely awful.
So are there some urgent actions of something we can, what's going on here? Maybe
for the stuff that Tara just told us, there are some actions that you can take as far as like the global gag rule and stuff like that. And I will put all of those in the follow-up email so you can click on them and do them that way. yeah, there's a ton of stuff that's on the Amnesty website, so I will just link a bunch of things to that, and then you can take all those actions, definitely. You know, I'm not really sure if there's necessarily an action right now going on with the Native Indigenous women in this country, but I mean, personally, that's something that was really shocking and awful to me, and I'd be interested in, you know, potentially us writing our own letter or doing our own action about it. If anyone is interested in helping to do something like that, I definitely would.
Yeah, solidarity with these women. I mean, it's just awful. God.
Yeah, there are some movements out there for women, for Indigenous women. I know some of those resources. I'm happy to share them with you guys if you want.
Please do. Yeah, that would be awesome. Definitely.
Yeah, maybe
And
we could adopt.
speaking of urgent action,
We could adopt it.
I say one thing.
yeah.
Yeah, I have to go soon, but I just wanted to add, I'm really, really preoccupied with how this abortion became a political issue.
Yeah.
In researching every issue I ever have, United States is motivated by money.
Right.
Nothing ever happens. And when she mentioned the decade she did, I was wondering, I'm going to research when trafficking in the US really got intense, and if it has something to intertwine. I mean, if people realize that the very man that they wanted to vote for on this one button issue was the same guy that was in Epstein's house while he was grooming women to be trafficked out of this country, Trump. I mean, I wonder if there's some kind of monetary connection. Where does it come into politics, abortion, unless it's about keeping women in the home? Like, I'm obsessed trying to find out how that, and whatever happened to separation of church and state.
Donna, I had this same question. I literally asked Tara during the AGM conference. She was talking about the global gag rule, and I literally was like, please explain to me how this happened, because there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. And she said that the rise to abortion being politicized was Ronald Reagan. And yeah, and
Ronald.
Yep. And that was when it became a politicized issue. And now I'm forgetting everything that she said after that.
Did he run on that too? Did he run on that platform too?
I don't know if he ran on the platform, but that's
with the lack of respect he has for women and what he has done. The fact that somebody would say he is blah, 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 a good person. I want to gag and throw up. That's all I have to say. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I really did Reagan run on that?
I don't know if he ran on it. We can ask Tara, or you can email her if you want, or I can email her. But I specifically asked her about the separation of church and state and how this became like such a politicized issue. And I'm like 98% sure she said it was Ronald Reagan's presidency, which made it the politicized issue. Now, I'm not sure if he necessarily ran on that campaign, but I think that there must have been some sort of like,
he didn't.
Yeah.
He ran on, he ran on gas prices went up in 1980, and there was the hostages in Iran. That was the issue. So he ran on Jimmy Carter is weak, strong. And then the second campaign in 1984, he ran on It's Morning in America. You know, you're just so much better off. You've got to stay with a Republican. So he really didn't. It did not.
Yeah.
Come up. It did not come up. Yeah.
I found in my notes when I asked this question, she said abortion became a very political issue in the late 80s. So it must have been right after Ronald Reagan, and that people were reactionarily pro-life because people vote with their party, not with their issue.
Right.
Yeah. So so because you're a Republican, you vote for Republicans, and as the issue became more and more politicized, you're still voting Republican, even if you don't necessarily believe.
Again, that's my question. When did it become a Republican issue. And this whole right, it's just like well, not to go off topic, but just like the guns and the Second Amendment. I'm in Florida. There are 15 Christian stations down here talking about, God, don't let them take your guns because then they'll take your rights. I'm like, but yet Jesus would say that? Is this stuff Jesus would say? Is that what they're wrong? I don't know. It just knocks me out. That's all.
Baffling. I
That's all I
know.
have to say.
I'm on the same wavelength, Donna. I feel you. All right, but I did tell Dorothy. Dorothy did some research into some justice
Good letter.
justice reform work that she asked that she could share. So I would love to have Dorothy share some of the research that she did, as well as kind of to segue us into this conversation. I believe Georgia officially put the stamp on the abolition of the death penalty today. Or sorry, Virginia.
Georgia's yes.
Yeah, could you imagine? My gosh.
Oh, wow.
So that's a really great thing. I'm really happy, and take it away, Dorothy, with our justice reform campaign.
Yeah, I really haven't done much research. It is a summary of a March, this March presentation in the National Geographic. And so the title of the search they have done is Wrongly Convicted and I must add, later exonerated prisoners in the United States. And I sent you today, or with Jessica, the summary. It's an attachment in one of the emails you have received from us. And so the numbers are all there in writing. I don't have a slide, but I know that Amara is very skilled in putting that on the screen. So maybe if she can do it, so I'll get started in the meanwhile because it's late. So
This is still being recorded. This is still being recorded. So everything, we can see it. Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, and you have the numbers also in the attachments you have received. So the recording started 1972 after a Supreme Court ruling that the death penalty violates the 8th Amendment. And then the court even condemned state laws and demanded reforms. And now, since that ruling, over 9,500 people have received a death sentence. Some people can receive multiple death sentences for different crimes. DNA testing, as well as the re-examination actions of police and lawyers, has led to exoneration of 182 death row inmates. So 182 out of 9,500 were exonerated. So out of these 182, 94 were blacks, 69 whites, 17 Latinos, 1 Native American, and 1 Asian. So overall, as of December 2020, there have been over 2,700 exonerations nationally. The length of time from sentencing to exoneration was from 10 to over 30 years. Timelines are broken down as follows: 61 people between 1 and 5 years on death row, 39, 6 to 10 years, 30, 11 to 15 years, 32, 16 to 20 years, and 30 plus years. Two of the three cases involved official misconduct. The gross three cases, misconduct of the law enforcement or police. The gross breakdown of the exoneration of persons sentenced to death from 1972 to 2020 are official misconduct 68%. So that's why they were exonerated. Perjury or false accusation 62%, misleading forensic evidence 29%, inadequate legal defense 25%, mistaken identity 19%, and false confessions 13%. So these are a lot of breakdowns. For the Black demographic, 78% were exonerated due to official misconduct, 62% to perjury or false accusation, 26% to mistaken identity, and 26% for misleading forensic. For whites, 52% exonerated due to perjury, 35% for misleading forensic evidence, 20% for an inadequate legal defense. Latinos were exonerated with 82% due to official misconduct, 65% due to perjury or accusation, false accusation, 41% mistaken identity, 12% for misleading forensics. And then the single Asian person was inadequate legal defense. So in the whole world, there are currently 2,255 roughly people on death row. Within the incarceration rates in the world. So in the US, it's currently 2,255 people on death row. Now, Virginia is the most recent state to abolish the death penalty, but it's still legal in 28 other states. Now, public support for the death penalty has fallen to 54% in 2020, so that's quite remarkable. And yet in the US, is one of the worst countries, one of only 13 countries who have performed at least one execution each year. Now, I think in Europe, Belarus still has the death penalty. I think that's the only one left as far as I know. Now, last year in the US, 17 prisoners were executed, 10 of them by the federal government. Now, Amnesty International has recorded a minimum of 657 executions in 20 countries. In 2019, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the USA topped this list in that order. So China is the worst. Worldwide, Latinos and white people have some of the highest rates of execution. So this was this March, an article with fantastic graphics, really very sophisticated graphics, easy to read. I just pulled out these numbers because I couldn't really make slides of these graphics. I'm not good at all these things. So that was an article by Philip Morris in National Geographic, March 2021. So that's the story. And now I don't know whether you want to discuss this. Otherwise, I could continue with the other things we prepared.
Yeah. First off, thank you so much for that. That's so great. What I can try and find the article online too and see if I can link it. Because I don't know, I assume it's online. If it's
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it is. Okay, good. Yeah, I'll try and find it so we can link
Yeah.
it so that other people can read it too, because I know that, you know, we're all passionate about ending the death penalty here. So thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you so much.
what is shocking to me is how few people have been exonerated. I mean, I thought it was more than that.
186,
It's really
it's
shocking.
not much.
No, it isn't.
I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that they put people through the ringer to have any sort of, you know, second trial or any sort of hearing. You know, it takes
Yeah.
15 years to get,
Yeah.
you know, anything, even the slightest thing done.
So unfortunately, it doesn't give the numbers of how many were wrongfully convicted. I couldn't see that there. So
I'm sure it's a lot.
So they were executed, and later it turned out
Right.
they were not guilty. So unfortunately, I couldn't find these numbers in the article. Maybe they're there. It's clearly a missing thing for me, and that's the real horrible thing that happened. And then it shows personally pictures and the personal stories of about 10, 15 previous convicts. I mean, really an amazing article. Yeah, it's very moving.
Yeah, it sounds it. I'm definitely going to give it a read, Dorothy. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what's next on your?
Yeah, we can go over the letters quickly. I didn't know, Jessica, since you did some of the work on it, if you wanted to talk a little bit about them too.
About the urgent, I'm linking here. There's the National Geographic link. You have to sign it, like subscribe to their website, and you get 4 articles a month or something like that.
Perfect.
But
Awesome.
4 articles a year, but yeah, you can. So talk about what the urgent actions this month.
Yeah,
or the
that would be great.
Take those over, and then I do the POC, huh?
Okay.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
present those very well. Yeah.
Thanks.
And just a second, do we have time to talk about Mr. Novalny at all? The dissident in Russia that was stopped being, that Amnesty International kicked him out as prisoner of conscience.
Sure.
Isn't he still in jail?
Apparently he's really doing very badly. There's reports that he's incredibly ill, and it looks like probably the Russians will kill him this time. But
maybe we can come to our POC, huh?
Right. Well,
that would fit the POC story.
Let me see.
Did you say he got kicked out by Amnesty?
He got kicked out by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience.
Now, do you know why?
There's an Amnesty International in England and the US Amnesty International, which is separate. So I'm not quite sure whether he's been kicked out by everyone. And the issue was that he was, you know, he said some nationalist white supremacist stuff. This is secondhand. I don't know what he said. But the thing is that he seems to be the only real opposition to Vladimir Putin. And he may well be a complete jerk. But the thing is, it's all they have. So my concern is that they need to have some kind of opposition. And you often have very flawed people. And I guess he's a very flawed person, but he has an enormous amount of supporters. And I thought it was pretty shocking. There was an article in Washington Post by Gary Kasparov and Alexander Vindman saying that they thought Amnesty International did a huge disservice saying that they were no longer considering him worthy of being a prisoner of conscience. And they were saying that they've probably condemned him to death because of it. It's interesting because clearly what we do really can affect things. And
yeah, you know what I'm thinking? I think that the person who runs POC, I think that if you email them and you tell them like you want to do a case, that they can like guide you in the right direction.
Mhm.
But the only thing is, if Amnesty kicked them off, they might tell you that they don't want you to use the Amnesty like name to do it.
But I'm not sure how connected all the amnesties are. I believe they're not. I mean, we all have the same name.
Yeah.
But I believe there's different prisoners of conscience in Britain than you have in the United
States. Mm-hmm.
Because there's different websites. And it's hard to believe.
I'll send you the contact and you can email them and ask them.
Thank you.
And if they say that like they don't want to support it or whatever, we could always like come up, if you wanted to write a letter and we could start signing it here at our group, and maybe, you know, since we're connecting with Penn's group and stuff, we could kind of start our own little thing too.
I like that idea. Wonderful. Yes. See,
I'd be down for that.
That's the thing. Amnesty International is not a monolith. I mean, there's a lot of very bright people who disagree with a lot of things, and it's I don't think there's necessarily a party line. You know, yeah.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Susanna. Really, I didn't even know, because I know that Amnesty International was heavily involved in his release and before, and also getting him back to Russia safely.
Yeah, right.
And I thought they had adopted him, but maybe they never did.
Yeah,
I remember we did an urgent action on him, I'm pretty sure, a few months ago.
I thought so too. I remember that as well.
Maybe in December or something, I forget when, but.
But how, Jessica, how connected is the International Amnesty International which is based in London, I believe, with the United States Amnesty International?
That's a good question, and I will certainly look into that, because it's worth looking into for sure. So
because maybe we haven't.
I will.
Maybe it's just the British have. I don't know. Yeah.
We need our Scottish.
We're always very connected. We were able to contact directly London, the Amnesty in Great Britain, which is the headquarters.
Right.
And we also had direct connection with the boss there, the chief, forgot his name at the moment, but I think it got less, and it's our fault, because London always was very, very responsive to anything we brought up to them. So 5 years ago, for sure, we still had a lot of direct contact with London, and didn't go via New York or so. So we went directly to London all the time. And then somehow the US wanted to become stronger and more independent. And I don't know how good or bad this is, but the decision-making on POCs is done in London, not here, not in the US.
I see. Yeah.
They do most of the research on POCs, prisoners of conscience, and make the decisions there whether they meet the criteria to become adopted. Yeah.
So what do you suggest, Dorothy? We do something as 1112? I mean, 1112, 112?
Yeah, I mean, I would approach London directly.
Okay.
go there directly, and because they have the ultimate last saying, and then go from there. Mhm.
Yeah, so it looks like, I'm just looking at the London site, the main site, and they said that they've shifted from a large London base to open regional offices in cities in Africa, Asia Pacific, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. Doesn't say anything about the United States. So
They shifted. What is that?
it just says that they've shifted from their large London base to these regional offices. They
What?
strengthen, the regional offices are to strengthen the work of the sections who already work at the national level in more than 70 countries.
Okay.
But it doesn't say anything about the US in that statement at all.
Mhm.
They just ignore,
So maybe we're not as connected.
they don't think we exist. We have a
Mm.
new leader though in Washington, Paul O'Connell.
Under Trump,
I know.
no wonder. Under Trump, they have to do that, but now they're probably coming back and are more hopeful and positive with the United States. But what can you do under Trump? I mean, the whole Europe was shutting off from the United States. They just knew there was nothing about human rights to do here, and refugees and so on. So I'm sure they will come back now, as whole Europe is coming back to us now, being more positive and hopeful.
Yeah, it talks about a global movement, but it doesn't talk about working together with us, and Europe. And,
Sure, they couldn't.
Yeah.
Couldn't. I mean, it was impossible practically. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, do we want to go over letters quick before we wrap up for the evening?
Jessica, urgent actions, yeah, and then I will talk about the POC.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. So we chose 3 urgent actions for this month. One from China, where a human rights defender was taken by police in February of this year for publicizing torture and ill treatment at a detention center there. She has not been heard from in a month, and her family and everyone are very concerned about her. This is the only one that only the ambassador has an email for this one. This is the only one out of the 3 that would have one that would need to be mailed, and that would be to the director. The second one we chose was in Bangladesh, where a writer and a cartoonist were detained last May for posting satirical cartoons about the Bangladesh's response to COVID-19. They were denied bail, and the writer died in prison in February of this year. The other gentleman, the cartoonist, was released, but has suffered a lot of injuries that they believe were caused by torture, and still faces up to 10 years in prison for exercising a right to freedom if convicted. And then the third one was Pakistan, and it was a couple that was imprisoned in 2013 for, there was a phone incident where some blasphemous messages were sent, and it had the SIM card of one of them in their name. They said it wasn't them, but they've been in prison since 2013. They were sentenced to death. They had an appeal that was supposed to be heard 6 years later, last April, and still has not been heard due to COVID-19. When they finally did get their last 2 hearing chances for these appeals, the judges left saying that the courts have concluded for the day, so they wouldn't be heard. That's where we stand on our 3 urgent actions for the month.
Is there anyone who doesn't know what it requires, how to respond to an urgent action? Anybody does not know who's new there? But so two are very, very recent. So that means be fast and be quick. Maybe you can save their lives because it happened to them in February 25th, so very recent. Now this week, Amnesty wrote us a note that no new urgent actions could be done for technical logistic reasons, but they will catch up on that. So these two are really, really urgent. And I hope that you either write to Amnesty, the Urgent Action Network, that you wrote these letters, or I can forward it and you send it to me. You have my email. I mean, we sent everything out today. So it's really pressing in time. You may save lives by reacting very quickly now. Now, China is 2013, so imprisoned since 2013. That's a very old case. I don't even know
That's
why
the Pakistani case. That's
Oh,
2013. China was February. Yep.
So Pakistan is the old one, and the two others, China and Bangladesh, are the very recent ones. Okay,
Definitely.
thank you.
Mhm.
And so now comes POC, the prisoners of conscience, and I have been responsible for POCs. It was always my passion since 1980. So that's over 40 years. In this group, 112, I'm a very, very ancient member of the group, really historical. And so that was always my passion. And I think the second most important thing we have to do is urgent actions, or both are equally important. So our prisoner is from Zimbabwe. His name is Samara. It's very close to Amara's name.
So I was just
Anybody
thinking.
realize that?
Yep.
So Amara, oh my gosh. So we chose the perfect name.
Mhm.
We selected this one because for many, many reasons, many of us, especially Susanna, are really deeply involved in Africa. Me too, I was there several times, but more like a tourist, not like she. She was really active and working there. Anyway, so he has been in prison now for 6 years. He disappeared. Nobody really knows where he is, and that's really terrible not to know. Now, before his abduction, he was the leader of a pro-democracy protest group in Zimbabwe, and his wife is now in South Africa. I'm coming to that, and I'm not sure why she's in South Africa and not in Zimbabwe. But anyway, he complained at that time about the economic conditions in Zimbabwe, and then he disappeared because he was criticizing the government. So he was targeted by security agents, he was beaten, he was abducted and unlawfully detained, but nobody knows where he is. And Amnesty is pretty sure that his disappearance is linked with pro-democracy activism. Now, we are calling in this letter, which you can just sign and then send to the authorities, and I'll come to that. You can in this letter, we are asking the authorities to establish an independent justice system so that he can be tried legally. And then we are also requesting that the commission of the inquiry makes public all their findings and that the trials are absolutely fair, and then respect the right to freedom of expression and stop harassing and intimidating activists. So these are the points we are asking them. And now in March, there was the 6th anniversary of his disappearance. So we were asked by Amnesty to take some solidarity action. So I hope you have done all this before, and so that means you should write to his wife and as a member of Amnesty International, but don't give your address. It's not quite clear why, probably not to endanger him, or so that they can find out who wrote this in details, and just tell them that we support her and we work on her husband's imprisonment and also support the children. So some of these letters go to, okay, here it is, ambassador in Washington, he has email. Then the next one has no email, that's the commissioner of police. And then the next one has email, chair of Human Rights Commission. So that's all in Zimbabwe. And then Minister of Home Affairs has email, and then it goes to the Office of the President. Also, there's no email available. So if there's no email available, I sent them by airmail, these letters, and be sure you have these blue airmail stripes on your letter, that of course airmail stamps, so that it goes in time and doesn't take months and months and goes by boat and God knows what, or very slow air transportation.
And gets stuck in the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was very inappropriate.
No, it was funny.
What happened?
Huh? What happened in the Suez Canal? It's stuck. No one's moving.
Oh, Suez Canal. I know the
No
story.
one's moving. Gosh.
Anyway. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your work, Dorothee and Jessica.
Yeah.
I know it's a lot of work to do, so you guys do a lot, so thank you.
What a wonderful meeting. Thank you, Amara.
All right, well,
You're a
so
wonderful organizer.
Computers and
Yes.
please. I guess I will end us out then. I think we're all set for today, but I'll be sending up a follow-up email with all of the things we talked about, all these resources and stuff, and sending some people points of contacts and things like that. And until then, happy human rights. Have a good month.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Yes.
You.
Thank you. Lovely seeing you,
Thank you.
Jessica. Really wonderful having you.
Oh, it's lovely to meet you all. Thank
Yeah,
you.
really. I hope you come back.
I will absolutely.
Good.
Hey. To get my mom involved too. She's very curious, but she couldn't come tonight, but I'll bring her next month and
Yeah.
see.
Definitely. Feel
if
free to
she's-
send
she wants
me
to.
her, if she uses her own email and stuff like that, feel free to send
Okay.
it to me and I can put her on the mailing list too, so she gets everything.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Now what do I do, Amara? I just press stop recording.
You just hit leave, the little red.
yeah.
Yeah, it'll it'll ask you to, or it'll just like convert it to a file on your computer once you end the meeting.
Yeah, I have a problem now too, yeah.
Yeah, it can take a little while to, since it's a longer meeting, it might take a little while to convert, but it usually you'll save it somewhere. It'll tell you where it'll go and then you'll have it.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So then I
Okay.
just do end,
All right.
and then it'll end for everyone.
Just end.
And then it will.
Yep,
okay.
it should end for
Thank-
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
All right. Bye,
Thank you so
guys.